Good morning, good afternoon, welcome. I'm Tracy Fessenden, Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to today's conversation, What Good is Theory? Religion, Critique, and Truth. This panel discussion is a joint event of ASU's Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, the Political Theology Network, and the Villanova Political Theology Project. Before we get started, a couple of quick items. If you would like to participate in the audience Q&A portion of today's event, you can submit questions throughout the event. On Zoom, please use the Q&A function. On YouTube, use the chat box to the right of the video, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. As always, more information about all the center's events and research can be found on our website, csrc.asu.edu. You can also sign up for a mailing list for updates on all our news and events, or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for coming. Thank you for pushing through Zoom fatigue to come to this, our very last event of the season at CSRC. Of course, the brilliant upside of Zoom is that we get to gather so many wonderful people in our digital space. Today we have 5 of them. I will briefly introduce them before taking my seat in the audience. We have with us Mayanthi Fernando. She is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Center for Cultural Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She is currently working on a book on the secularity of the post-humanist turn. Andrew Prevot is Associate Professor of Theology at Boston College. He is currently working on his next book, The Mysticism of Ordinary Life, Theology, Philosophy, and Feminism. Inese Radzins is an assistant professor of philosophy at California State University, Stanislaus. Her current project is a book titled The Spirit of Labor, Simone Weil's Political Theology. And Jason Ananda Josephson Storm is professor and chair in the Department of Religion and chair in Science and Technology Studies at Williams College. His latest book, which you can pre-order but hasn't been released just yet, is Metamodernism, The Future of Theory. And last, certainly not least, our moderator, Vincent Lloyd, is Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Global Interdisciplinary Studies at Villanova University. He directs the Villanova Political Theology Project, co-edits the journal Political Theology, and directs Villanova's Africana Studies program. So thank you all so much for joining us. And now I will hand this off to Vincent.
Thank you, Tracy, and welcome everyone on behalf of the Political Theology Network. We're pleased to be partnering with Arizona State University in hosting this event, what we hope will be the first of future partnerships as well with Arizona State's Center for Study of Religion and Conflict. Just to briefly frame the conversation today, theory and its critical modality can show us what the world conceals. It can name and challenge the obfuscations of wealth, whiteness, patriarchy, and power in its multitude of forms. But does it reveal truth? If not, what kinds of relation to truth might theory pursue? Do theory's critical commitments make it necessarily proximate to the secular? Is there a place in critical theory for what we might call critical theology? Or inversely, what is a place of critique within political theology? What might allow elements within critical theory and elements of religious traditions to engage in converging projects around truth, power, or the good. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to our first panelist, and then we'll proceed through the 4, each offering brief opening reflections. Mayanthi?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you especially to Tracy and to Vincent and the rest of the organizing team. I want to make 3 points that are somewhat related in these opening comments. Before I do that, I should add that I'm perhaps a bit of an outsider here, since I don't usually engage the concept of political theology per se. So first point that I'd like to take up, the first point, sorry, is that I'd like to take up some of the questions that Vincent actually just posed very nicely. So question, do theory's critical commitments make it necessarily proximate to the secular? My response, I don't know what to do with this abstract category theory. What kind of theory? Where? For whom? And why would theory's commitments necessarily be critical, let alone secular? I would want to unpack the term theory and track its genealogy, and maybe Jason will actually do that. I would want to do the same for critique, which Talal Asad does in his contribution to Is Critique Secular? Even within the long history of Christianity, from the medieval period through the Reformation, through Kant, through 20th century neo-Kantism, Asad shows that critique has entailed and signified quite different understandings, activities, and objects. Next question. Is there a place in critical theory for what we might call critical theology? My response, aren't many theological traditions not already critical and theoretical in some fashion? Who are we, and to what and to whom are we giving this name critical theology? And maybe this is where I don't fully know what this concept, political theology, is doing and what the we is here. Next question. Or inversely, what is the place of critique within political theology? My response, doesn't that depend on what we mean by critique and also what we mean by political theology and to which political theology we are referring? And to be perfectly frank, as someone who works on Islamic traditions, this question seems a little too close to the commonplace assumption that religious people, and especially Muslims, do not partake in what we're calling critique, that critique emerges out of secularity. So the asymmetric geopolitics of the contemporary moment produce a series of questions. Does Islam have a critical tradition? Do Muslims do critique? That Muslims are then obliged to respond to. But the question starts with the assumption that somehow Islam and perhaps other religious traditions too don't do critique. So to answer the question, to show how critique does exist in Islamic traditions, is to play the game on unequal terrain. That is the terrain of the secular academy, indeed of secularity itself. So next question. What might allow elements within critical theory and elements of religious traditions to engage in converging projects around truth, power, or the good? My response. This seems to suggest that critical theory and religious traditions are separate domains, but I think it also suggests a desire to somehow reach out as critical theorists in one domain and work together with folks in that other domain, religious traditions. But our domain is not just critical theory, it's the university, right? What Susan Harding has called the citadel of secular modernity. That citadel upholds certain limits, certain truths that we, despite being critical theorists, cannot cross without losing our credibility as academics. This gets to another question that was posed to us, namely, is there a place in critical theory for what we might call critical theology? To unpack this question, I want to quote Asad again from the piece that I mentioned, but substitute the secular academy in places where he used secular Europe. So Asad writes, what would happen if religious language were to be taken more seriously in the secular academy and the preventable deaths in the global south of millions from hunger and war was to be denounced as blasphemy, as the flouting of ethical limits for the sake of what is claimed to be freedom? Of course, the secular academy's prescription of theological language makes such a use of the word blasphemy inconceivable. But does this impossibility merely signal a secular reluctance to politicize religion, or is it a symptom of an incapacity? End quote. And I read Asad here as meaning a kind of secular incapacity for certain modes of thinking, being, and acting in and on the world, and perhaps even an ethical incapacity of sorts. Can I say, for instance, within the confines of the secular academy, that when I and others protest against injustice, we are joined not just by the living, but also by the dead, by ancestor spirits, by angels? Can I say that I and others experience prophetic dreams in the barzakh, dreams that may be divinely inspired, dreams that guide our actions in the world? So that's my first point, is to go through those questions. My second point, in going back and rereading Asad's essay for this event, I was struck by the etymology of the term criticism, which has its origin in the Greek verb krino. Asad writes that it was first used in the judicial sphere and referred to the ability to differentiate, to ask probing questions, and to judge. In this worldly arena, Asad continues, the semantic beginnings of what we now call critique did not aspire to conquer universal truths, but to resolve particular crises justly and to correct particular virtues within a particular way of life. Interestingly, this earlier ethically oriented understanding of critique resonates with an earlier pre-modern sense of religio in the Christian tradition as having to do with acts of devotion and prayer, that is, having to do with personal transformation and the cultivation of an ethical orientation or virtuous behavior. So there are interesting parallels too between the transformation of critique into the site of universal reason aimed at uncovering universal truths and the transformation of religio into religion as a set of propositional truths. And therefore, an even more interesting genealogy to track now that religion or religious traditions has come to stand as separate from, indeed contrary to, critique, critical theory, right? My third point, if critique is often juxtaposed against religion or religious traditions, I have noticed amongst my colleagues and graduate students that critique is now increasingly opposed to something called care. This distinction seems to have been inspired by Bruno Latour's 2004 essay, Why Has Critique Run Out of Steam? There, Latour distinguishes between the ostensibly haughty, self-satisfied work of critique and a different kind of work whose import, he tells us, will no longer be to debunk, but to protect and to care. In this new dispensation, critique entails denunciation, destruction, and the foreclosure of livable futures. And what we need instead, Latour tells us, is an ethics and politics of care. Now, I do not understand or recognize this distinction between critique and care, or the association of critique with destruction. In my view, critique is a practice of care for oneself, for others, and for the world. And here I follow both Michel Foucault and Saba Mahmood. For Foucault, and I'm citing Butler's engagement with Foucault here, for Foucault, critique was a practice in which we pose the question of the limits of our surest ways of knowing, exposing the limits of our epistemological horizon and making the contours of the horizon appear, as it were, for the first time. In other words, the object of critique here is as much oneself, one's surest ways of knowing and being in the world, as it is something external to the self. Critique is a practice of epistemological and ontological destabilization, self-destabilization, before any other kind of destabilization can take place. And here is Mahmoud on critique, which she articulates in Religious Difference in a Secular Age. And I quote, "To critique a particular normative regime is not to reject or condemn it. Rather, by analyzing its regulatory and productive dimensions, one only deprives it of innocence and neutrality so as to craft, perhaps, a different future." There are two elements of that last sentence that are key. First, the term to craft, so as to craft, perhaps, a different future. I take Mahmoud to be gesturing implicitly to that older Greek notion of critique as fundamentally a practice, indeed a practice of virtue towards some notion of justice. Justice here not writ large and grand and universal, but rather particular to the situation at hand. And second, the term perhaps, so as to craft perhaps a different future. Again, critique is not meant to posit self-assuredly a clear future, but to chip away at the present, to bring a glimmer of a different, more just, more livable world into view. Critique here, both self-critique and the critique of the power and normativity of secularity, critique is a necessary practice of care for the world and vital to any project for justice. So, and I'll end here, I'm not sure that truth is the operative term in the trifecta alongside religion and critique, but rather perhaps justice or even simply livability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayanthi, and we can turn to Andrew.
Well, thank you all to the organizers, and let me just jump right into my remarks here. So critical theory, as I understand it, analyzes cultural products that purport to be good, true, or rational, but contain elements that contradict such a positive evaluation. A cultural product could be a text, a work of art, an idea, an institution, a practice, or really anything that mediates human involvement in the world. If adhering strictly to a negative dialectical method, the exposition of such contradictions should take the form of an immanent critique, which shows that the values espoused in a cultural product are not consistently embodied by it. When employing the method of negative dialectics, one does not presuppose any basis of critique outside the cultural product in question, but only sheds light on the ways it fails to live up to its own standards. This is the method recommended by Theodor Adorno, and this type of critical theory starts in medias res and simply tries to identify the contradictions that are encountered in the things such as they are. By contrast, the Latin American philosopher of liberation, Enrique Dussel, who is also a major source for contemporary decolonial theory, argues that a negative dialectical method is insufficient. Dussel proposes what he calls an analectical method of critical theory, which would evaluate cultural products on the basis of perspectives, experiences, and lives that exist beyond the limited horizons of meaning and value that are represented by such cultural products. Dussel worries that the method of negative dialectics leaves critical theory trapped in the ontological sameness of the Western cultural imaginary. He thinks critically from the space of a metaphysical exteriority, a positive alterity, or a colonial underside. Dussel's analectical method supplements Adorno's practice of immanent critique with a critique from a transcendent vantage point. If interpreted in strictly materialist terms, such a transcendent vantage point is simply the historical concreteness of a different culture whose products would require their own operations of negative dialectics. But for Dussel, who draws on the Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas and the Catholic philosopher Xavier Zubiri, this critical otherness is also a site of divine epiphany. The transcendence that grounds his decolonial, analectical critical theory is not merely a material difference of cultures, but something like an experience of divine judgment or divine justice breaking into modern history through its oppressed undersides. If one brackets the theological aspects of Dussel's analectical method, it still provides a valuable alternative to mere immanent critique by suggesting the need for a specifically decolonial critique, which would come from the outside. Many of Dussel's key insights can therefore be translated into a more or less secular idiom. Yet, as a theologian myself, I do find the theological aspects of his method interesting and worthy of further discussion. The disclosure of contradictions in cultural products did not, in fact, originate with modern forms of secular critical theory. This sort of critical practice has deep roots in ancient religious and spiritual traditions, which continue to inform the works of critically minded theologians today. I've written a couple of essays that distinguish 4 different strands, genres, or approaches to critical theology. There is a prophetic approach, which critiques cultural products by interpreting and applying a divine law in a concrete historical situation. There is an apocalyptic approach, which critiques cultural products through the dramatized perspective of an ultimate battle between good and evil at the end of the world. There is an ascetical approach, which critiques cultural products in view of their connection with passions that are thought to be detrimental to self or society, for example, greed or vainglory. Finally, there is a mystical approach, which critiques cultural products against the lofty standard of a perfect yet incomprehensible union with divine wisdom or love. We can see these various approaches to critical theology at work in many different political, liberation, Black, feminist, queer, post-colonial, and decolonial theologies within and outside of the Christian tradition, which is the one out of which I work. Each of these approaches engages in some degree of negative dialectics or immanent critique. We can see this, for example, in the warning against false prophets, who seem to speak for God, but in fact are speaking for some other interests, and in admonitions to avoid ascetical practices that are driven by self-interested passions and therefore contradict the meaning of asceticism. Often enough, theologians identify theology itself as a cultural product that is not living up to its own standards. However, although these genres of critical theology have some dialectical aspects or some forms of immanent critique, they are largely analectical in Dussels' sense, insofar as they are grounded in the appeal to a divine other that transcends any given cultural product. The fact that any such appeal must occur concretely through a culture and therefore constitutes a cultural product that can be analyzed critically for its contradictions is a proposition on which secular critical theorists and critical theologians can fully agree. Critical theologians do not critique secular culture while marking religious objects off as off limits. On the contrary, critical theologians use negative dialectical and analectical methods to critique both secular and religious cultural products in very similar ways. The divisive issue between secular critical theory and critical theology, as far as I can tell, is not about whether religious cultural products must be scrutinized rigorously for their contradictions. Both sides agree on this. Nor is the issue whether immanent critique is the only valid method of critique, since a materialist form of analectical decolonial critique can go beyond the immanence of negative dialectics without constructing transcendence in theological or non-cultural forms. The divisive issue, in fact, is whether the very idea of appealing to a transcendent divine other has any truth, goodness, or rationality to it whatsoever. If the value of the theological is zeroed out, that is, if the immanent critique of theology by the likes of Friedrich Nietzsche and George Bataille and other champions of modern atheism is really thoroughly devastating, then the strictest methodological atheism would be necessary for any practice of critical theory worthy of the name. However, if some truth, goodness, or rationality remains in the very idea of the theological, then one's labor as a critical thinker may involve first disentangling what is of epistemic or moral value from what is not in various theological traditions, and secondly, employing the positive theological remainder that one finds through that work as a basis of critical judgment vis-a-vis all manner of cultural products, be they secular, religious, or otherwise. Although appeals to divine law have functioned violently throughout history, there may yet be a prophetic interpretation of divine law that resists violence in a decisive way at a crucial juncture, for instance, in the speeches and sermons of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Similarly, although apocalyptic discourse has tended to be politically damaging, an apocalyptic vantage point may yet clarify important issues of right and wrong. For example, in John Sobrino's juxtaposition of the kingdom and the anti-kingdom in the context of a poverty-stricken El Salvador. Although asceticism has been shaming of the body and of its affects, some ascetical discipline may be key to avoiding ecological catastrophe, as political theologian Dorothy Zola surmises. Although mystical traditions can be elitist and fanatical, there may yet be a form of mystical union with God that provides much needed critical distance from the death-dealing forces of the world, as one sees, for instance, in the mystical life of Sojourner Truth. This smattering of examples illustrates my reasons for believing that the theological as such is not devoid of truth, goodness, or rationality, but may yet assist critical theory in its efforts to overcome the contradictions of such values, which permeate religious and secular cultural products alike. Both, by the way, in the hegemony of Western modern cultures and in the cultures that come from the undersides of colonial modernity, which again do require their own critical processes. So in short, what I'd like to say is that yes, a critical theology is possible. And I hope I've suggested some of the reasons and ways that it is. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And now we can turn to Inese.
Great, thank you all again for the organizing the conference and for the invitation, and also to the other panelists. So my comments today are going to focus on the French phenomenologist Michel Henry. What is interesting in his work is his contestation of what theory both is and can do. So Mayanthi talked about critique. I'm going to be talking more about theory and what theory is. The summary for today's panel suggested that theory in its critical modality can show us what the world conceals. Henri's work suggests, on the contrary, that theory itself conceals reality and thus also obfuscates truth. My brief comments today are meant to shed light on how theory itself might be a problem and to ask what other possibilities there might be for considering life together, reality, religion, and truth. I want to begin by saying that until recently, I was a firm believer in theorizing and teaching theory. Many of my undergraduate courses in philosophy began, excuse me, by asking students to read and discuss bell Hooks's theory as liberatory praxis. However, my recent encounter with Henri is making me rethink my relationship to theory and theorizing. And what my comments today are going to address that in two sections. So the first one is outlining the problem according to Henri. And then the second section will be considering his suggestions for encountering life otherwise than through theory. What I want to think about, so here's the first section. What I want to think about today is how theory might be a problem. So Henri writes, and this is a quote, "Physics, chemistry, biology, social or human sciences, political economy, you know so little about the human. And that is not because you still have a lot of progress to make, but because life is not situated where you are looking or within your field of vision." That's the end of the quote. For Henri, theory depends upon an erasure of what he calls life or living subjectivity. He says very clearly in that quote that I just read, life is not situated where you are looking. For Henri, the word life denotes living subjectivity and the way any individual senses their living or their life activity, to use a phrase from Marx. Life and lived subjectivity refer to a reality that Henri claims is ignored by theory, whether that's human sciences, political economy, philosophy, critical theory, theology, all in his eyes are guilty. What is crucial for Henri is that theory cannot attend to or speak to life in its livingness. So in other words, theory obfuscates reality. And reality and life are interchangeable terms for Henri here. He offers the example of a biology student a biology student sitting in a library reading about the genetic code. But for our purposes, we could consider the student reading a book about critical theory. The student is acquiring scientific knowledge by reading. The genetic code is an object the student is learning about. It is presented to her in the book as a theory to understand. However, Henri says, it is not scientific knowledge that allows her to acquire the scientific knowledge contained in the book. It is not in virtue of this knowledge that she moves her hands or eyes or focuses her thought. Scientific knowledge is abstract. Moving her eyes to read or her hands to turn the page or her body to get up and get a drink of water, like I just did, or the anxiety that she senses about an upcoming exam, or remembering the kiss of her lover from the previous night, these are all subjective actions. And it is the subjective actions that offer a knowledge of life. So Henri calls this a knowledge of life, rather than abstract knowledge or theoretical knowledge. His concern is with this knowledge of life, which allows us to gain objective and abstract knowledge, whether about the genetic code or about critical theory. Henri says life, and this is living knowledge that he's talking about here, is the alpha and omega of every organization and every human development because it defines transcendental humanity, feeling, understanding, imagining, acting, and also the suffering and enjoyment without which there is no humanity or human being. The problem that Henri identifies with theory is that, like all scientific knowledge, it abstracts from life itself. Like the genetic code, theory comes to understand the living, breathing subject as a thing or object to quantify. Theory, by definition, thinks about X, or contemplates or considers something, a what or an object. In order to think about, one must reduce the topic of thought to a datum or a thing. And there may be something inevitable about that. It may be unavoidable. The living, breathing subject is erased in order to be thought, theorized, quantified, and counted. For those of you familiar with Marx, Henri's critique of theory might sound familiar. Just as Marx observed that capital transformed living labor and living laborers into dead labor, objects to be used in factories in capital for Marx, Henri's critique of theory applies this idea to forms of knowing. Knowledge of life, lived subjectivity, living labor, is transformed into a deadening kind of knowledge. Henri has an elaborate analysis of how this happens, but his main argument is that in the West, Galilean science and its emphasis on objectivity permeates all forms of knowing. In other words, theory only considers something real when it can objectify it, map it, explain it, count it, or manipulate it. Henri concludes that when individuals are reduced to things, numbers, data, facts, the knowledge provided is empty. Theory, like the genetic code the student studies, abstracts. In other words, it distances itself from what it tries to understand, which would be reality, life, sensibility, or truth. In particular, theory leads to an abstraction of life itself and the knowledge of life that each living subjectivity, each person is and has. Fundamentally for Henri, theory produces an objectification of the subject and of life that distances us from life itself. For Henri, life, reality, subjectivity is other than its abstraction. His writing is drawing attention to the limitations of knowledge in order to in order to point to what has been forgotten, subjectivity. One might say that Henri's work is trying to keep subjectivity subjective or life living. He offers an example from the social sciences and its need to collect data for studies on sexuality and suicides. He writes, "Does the fact of knowing that there have been in some time, place, and circumstance so many suicides or so many sexual acts committed add anything whatsoever to our understanding of the anxiety or vertigo that surround these behaviors?" That's the end of the quote. Objectifying subjective actions, whether of suicide, sexuality, loss, or love, does not tell us anything about one's sensibility. How is it that one senses their sexual activity? Or how does one experience the anxiety that may lead to suicide? What about the feel of loss? A subjective understanding would consider the individual's affectivity. The data and facts may offer something. I'm unclear what Henri would say that is, but they do not tell one anything about the living, breathing individual experiencing these actions. Okay, so having identified the problem, Henri asks us to consider how, I think that the question that he poses for the panel or for me today is how one might keep subjectivity subjective. How does one allow life in living? The question might be, if theory cannot reveal reality, what does? How does one do justice to reality or life? Or one of the topics on the panel, truth. So I'm going to turn now to my second section, which is the way to keep subjectivity subjective for Henri might be to attend to life and what he calls cultures of life, so that cultures of life can speak to this kind of subjectivity without having to objectify it. So subjectivity, very briefly for Henri, is the unique and singular capacity of any individual to be alive. He offers numerous terms for it: ipseity, autoaffection, sensing oneself, and just plain living. It is the actualization of the force of life in a living body. Again, he offers numerous examples. Consider the runner as they run, the chef as they cook, the parent as they hold a child. It is life's capacity, this is a quote, to experience itself immediately in the embrace of pathos, which lets it coincide with itself. It's the end of the quote. This auto-affection is one's subjectivity, a kind of primal or transcendental knowledge that is foreign to representation and objective knowledge. This living is not only a singular endeavor, so it's not just mine, it's not just an isolated subject, because every individual shares in this experience of life and living. So it's unique to each individual, and yet it is happening to all of us. What characterizes this kind of life is its impetus for production, so that life is creative fundamentally. And I'm thinking here of the quote from Mahmoud about it being about crafting that was mentioned earlier, about craft. So what distinguishes Henri's living subjectivity is its aesthetic quality. It involves creative production, and this is what he's going to call culture. So culture is life's self-fulfillment, and it's also very practical. So one could consider taking care of life's necessities, providing food, shelter, or clothing. In living and addressing these needs, human beings create. We have cuisine, architecture, and design. And it is these kinds of creations that Henri says reveal life. This is where life is found. So culture is not limited to its high forms, whether paintings in museums or music in opera houses. Rather, culture is practically everywhere that life flourishes. So he notes that there are cultures of food, shelter, work, erotic relations, or relations to the dead. Such relations provide an initial definition of the human. So what Henri values, and what I suggest determines his spirituality, the idea of reality, the idea of truth, is the ability of lived subjectivities to produce culture. The living that each person does brings them together with others in sharing various communal or cultural productions. So he says, in a society understood as a community of the living within life, culture is everywhere. What is most human and thus most spiritual in Henri, and this I think is the theological point, the critical point, and the point that might be his response to theory, is life and livingness. So when Henri asks us to consider, as we think about what theory might be, he asks us to think about, or this is my translation of Henri's lessons for today, or Henri's thoughts for today. Can we find a place, or can we think about a place where there is less theory, even as we all are, many of us teach in the academy, or perhaps a more humane theory? I'm not sure if that's possible. And then, so that's on the one side, less theory or a more humane theory. And on the other side, more life and more culture, whether food, shelter, work, erotic relations, or relations to the dead. So more culture. How is that possible? And how can we think about that in terms of critical theory and political theology? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Inez. And now finally we turn to Jason, JJ.
Sorry, I was muted there. Okay, here I am. Let me start timer beginning now. So first of all, I want to just say I feel honored and humbled to be at this gathering. Your papers have all been exciting and provocative, and it's just great to see you. And so here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to add it into the chat stream, a kind of outline. Hopefully this will paste. Let me try that. Okay, it's not. Wait, please don't start my timer yet, because this needs to happen. Am I blocked from posting in the chat stream? Okay, bummer. Won't let take a paste? Yeah.
If it's too long, it might not be able to paste. So
Right.
that would probably work.
Okay, great. Okay, so here is what I'm going to do then. I'll chunk it up. Thank you for that help, Sarah. Okay, so here is what I'm going to do. This is going to take me a little longer to cut and paste bit by bit. Forgive me for the technical issue. I apologize. I thought this would be faster, but maybe it's not. And
in the meantime, attendees, if you would like to submit your questions through the Q&A function, please feel free to do that. If you'd like it directed to one specific person, you can make that annotation. If you want it directed to the panel, feel free to do that as well. So, all right, you set?
All right, I'm set. Here we go. Okay. So first, the English word theory in the round table plays on a particular ambiguity between a kind of lowercase theory, which we might use to refer to something like an explanatory generalization, or maybe a system of observations, think, I don't know, theory of gravity, and a second capital T theory, which generally refers to perhaps a particular canon of texts and body of interpretive methods, including lowercase t theories. So the origins of this capital T theory are complex. I wanted to provide a genealogy exactly as Mayanthi thought I would want to do. I only have a couple of minutes, but I'll say I want to make 2 points about the history of that capitalized noun. First, here's how it emerged. In the mid-20th century, Anglo-American philosophy decided to reformulate itself as a scientific discipline. This, combined with increasing overspecialization, primed scholars in other humanities and social sciences to look elsewhere for grand theorizing. Restated, hyper-specialization of philosophy produced an unmet need. Second, the role previously accorded to philosophy in North American universities came to be occupied instead by imported European forms of thought that were marked as theory, in contrast to the logical positivism that had taken over philosophy departments. Literature departments in particular imported theorizing because of pre-existing popularity of literary forms of existentialism. And these soon became key sites for the formation of a canon of capitalized theory as such, which was produced in a bricolage fashion by drawing together European thinkers from different disciplinary backgrounds that were often opposed to each other. Religion departments followed quickly thereafter for a range of reasons. Okay, already from the beginning, capital T theory was linked to emancipatory political struggles, both within existing departments and in complement to the birth of women's studies and many ethnic studies programs, which had sprung up in the same time period to address the needs of an increasingly diversified student body. Theory was originally supposed to be progressive, or at least at the outset to have a political and ethical payoff. Moreover, in broad brushstrokes, capital T theory came to dominance as a combination of A, emancipatory politics, B, philosophical skepticism, C, a specific set of explanatory generalizations, and D, a crude philosophy of language or rhetoric. Here is the thing. I think scholars need theory or something like it, both for our epistemological and ethical ambitions. I think this is the case because we're in the profession of evaluating and producing scholarship. And that means whether we're aware of it or not, we need something like an epistemology or some variation of such, some kind of ethics or intellectual goal, some various notion of meaning, and a set of research methods for studying our subjects and subject matter as diverse as it is. As much as Michel Henry's critique of the stultifying potential of quantitative forms of theorizing are legit, I don't think theory has to be quantitative and doesn't have to be the vampire that sucks the soul out of the thing that we're studying, but can be a way for caring for it and enlivening it with critical reflection and power. But bluntly put, our scholarly work involves writing reviews, evaluating other people's arguments on our sources, interpreting meaningful utterances, objects, and texts, grading students, teaching them to evaluate evidence or think about ethical implications, and so on. So basically, our day-to-day job involves something like epistemology, ethics, and hermeneutics. That's sort of, they're there whether we want to see them or not. So we don't need to agree about our epistemologies or ethics. I'm not trying to have one universal version of something that we all have to share at all. I think diversity of ideas in this context is wonderful, but I want to emphasize that our workaday business of scholarship is typically entangled in questions of knowledge, value, power, meaning, and method. And that's what your theory aimed to provide. So contra my colleagues in the history department who say they don't need theory, that just means that they're being ignorant of the power and the knowledge relations that are going on in the worlds that they study, right? And their own relationship and function as scholars. It's to deny theory is to deny often self-reflexivity, at least in function or practice. This is also true for those of us who work with or see our work as engaged in emancipatory political struggle. I don't just think scholars need big picture thinking. For people who are activists, we need big picture formulations. We need abstract thinking, and we need critical epistemologies in order to advance stance what I hope that many of us share, which is a commitment to unmasking and challenging systems of hegemony and domination. Before we can fix problems, we have to be able to identify them. In order to dismantle oppression, we have to be able to describe it. We need at least some capacity to speak truth to power. This is why, and I was going to quote bell hooks here, but we've already gestured there, so I won't. But this is why skeptical dogmatisms have run aground when they become too expansive. Complete rejections of the possibility of knowledge, or the assumption that everything is equally discursive, undercut not just scholarship, but also the grounds of political action. As the saying goes, quote, theory without practice is empty, but practice without theory is blind, end quote. But here's the problem. Despite its ambitions, I think a lot of us are frustrated because most of what we think of as theory is bullshit. And I mean this in the philosophical sense. The philosopher Harry Frankfurt famously argued that the essence of bullshit is, quote, a lack of connection to a concern with truth, unquote. In Frankfurt's account, a bullshitter doesn't care whether what they're saying describes reality correctly or not. They just want to advance their interests. Moreover, as scholars like J.A. Cohen and Michael Otsuka have both argued, much of philosophy itself would count as bullshit under this definition because philosophy is ripe with unclarifiable unclarity, strategic ambiguity, and pseudo-profundity. And this holds doubly true for theory. Many scholars seem to think that theory is just saying stuff that sounds cool. Look, I like it too. I'm not trying to strip the poetry from our writing, but if a scholar refers to something like, quote, transgressive ontogenesis, or says nothings, without being really thinking really hard about what we mean by what we're saying, then we're basically bullshitting. It might be politically well-meaning. Indeed, much of the academic bullshit masks conventional neoliberal left-wing politics in a language of radicalism, but you probably wouldn't know what transgressive ontogenesis was if it landed on your shoe. And I use that as an example. I just made up that. That's not a real one. I'm not naming a specific person or attacking them. But according to this line of critique, academic bullshit advances because people asserting it don't really care if it's true or not. It just sounds cool. And hey, maybe it'll help you in your professional life. And so accordingly, it is no accident that bullshit comes to dominate alongside the increasing specialization of academic disciplines. This is not something that the French invented. This is not something that is located only in a group of theorists we don't like. There's a lot of academic bullshit in a vast majority of over-specialized disciplines. As it happens, for historical reasons, though, much of theory is specifically, capital T theory, often downright hostile toward knowledge, truth, or generalization as such. I think this should bother us more than it does. To explain, while theory historically was typically situated on the political left, one of the most interesting developments of the last few years has been the sense that skepticism now lives on the right. This should not have been a surprise. A broader view of history shows us that dogmatic skepticisms, rejections of theory en suite or whatever, have generally been either depoliticizing or used to justify conservatism and authoritarianism. Let me give you a concrete example. The British Prime Minister A.J. Balfour, who is primarily famous for his role in British colonial destabilization of the Middle East, was himself a philosopher who wrote a text called The Defense of Philosophical Doubt, where he argued for the importance of brand and universal skepticism. He could, and he's not alone. We might think of Fox News, Trump, post-truth, etc. All that is to say, rejecting the possibility of evidence or knowledge as such often terminates in bullshit, and the critique of knowledge has often been, in effect, a defense of status quo power. So what would a non-bullshit theory look like? I try to do something humbly, and I don't know if I do it that well, but I'm trying to do it in a new book that's coming out in July, which you can read and help me see where it's wrong. But in the first instance, I think that unmasking false ideologies and exposing the power behind various categories often necessitates marshalling evidence that the particular category in question is occluding more than it reveals, or has been formulated to meet the needs of particular groups and the like. Demonstrating that women are paid less than men for the same work is an evidential claim that works to unmask the patriarchy. Similarly, demonstrating that Black folk are disproportionately killed by police officers is a key piece of evidence about the violent inherent in structures of institutional racism. Put differently, understanding climate skepticism, the cause of racism, secular hegemony, and their entanglements requires broader reflections on knowledge and value that we might as well call theory. We don't need to share our epistemologies or ethics. I love to disagree, but these projects are to be developed, not abandoned. Given everything that you've said, you might think I'm a partisan of truth, but like Mayanthi, I'm a little bit allergic to this word truth. At the very least, I think we need to be equally sophisticated about it. I don't want to be a table-slapping partisan of fact. The word true in English covers everything from personal sincerity, what people really believe, or logical validity, all animals are cats. My dog is an animal, therefore my dog is a cat. Logically sound, but not a good description of my pets. Two claims about which we have good or more or less supporting evidence. Often these things are in tension. And all that is to say, I prefer notions of evidence to truth. But if pressed, I would say I'm a relativist about truth. To take a step back, relativism has a bad reputation, but contextual relativism is trivially true. That my coffee cup is on my right is a true statement relative to my seat at the table. More importantly, many statements would seem to be true at least relative to their circumstance or context of assertion. For example, the validity of the statement, quote, the population of my town is 7,000 people, end quote, is relative both to the context, what town am I talking about? And the time period, when am I talking about? And to think of these simple statements of fact as if they were non-relative is a mistake. Similarly, the truth of statements like, quote, Francis Bacon was a scientist, end quote, would seem to be relative to which Francis Bacon we're talking about, as well as the changing and richly contextual meaning of the word scientist. So many types of handed down to us truths turn out to exhibit similar issues and problems. So that's why I have issues with this capital big truth notion. So what does that mean for the relationship between theory and knowledge? First, I think we need to learn to be skeptical of skepticism. This is not to undercut critique. We need to amplify critique. We need to make critique more critical, but we can infuse it with the kind of ethics of care and something else. We can't let it terminate in mere grand skepticism. I think even better for emancipatory politics would be a kind of humble knowledge rather than a complete rejection of knowledge as in total. Second, I think we also can afford to be and need to be clear about values. And values that have long been missing from the huge sector of academic writing under a mistaken notion of objectivity, which presumed that you had to strip values away from things in order to be scientific or rational or something. I think there, Michel Henry's critique, I'm sure, would remind us that certain notions of objectivity strip out the various things that make our life worlds rich. So and even as they, I will argue, smuggle in values disguised as epistemological claims. So I think we need to be critical of that as well. But I think that I'm not a political theologian. The word political theology is not a phrase I've used in my own writings. I'm a little bit allergic to it because I encountered it first in Carl Schmitt, who was like literally a Nazi, like literally a card-carrying Nazi, and that always bothers me. But anyway, I'm trying to move past that. But I think if there is room for political theology, I think that there is something there important in terms of critique. And I agree with some of the others here that the secular embodies its own values, which it often doesn't want to recognize as such. So the presumed tension between the critical and the theological is one that we're going to have to abandon. And especially if we're going to work past the kind of apocalyptic versions of political theology that Andrew was talking about and on towards something that has greater potential built into it. So all that is to say, well, I have a couple of points of disagreement with some of the things that Inez said and that I'd love to talk through and work through. I think we're all very much on the same page here. And even then, I think those could probably be nuanced. We may be agreeing more than we disagree. Just thank you for taking the time to listen to me, and thank you for having me here to speak to you all. I will shut up now.
Thank you to each of the four wonderful panelists. You've given us great provocations, and I know many of us probably have questions. As Sarah mentioned in the question and answer function on Zoom, you're welcome to share questions. For those watching the simulcast on YouTube, you can also ask questions there. I know I have a list of questions here, but before we get into questions from the audience and from me, I wonder if any of the panelists would like to pose questions to each other or respond to what they heard from other panelists. I know some of that was already beginning toward the end there. Yes.
Is that for me or?
Yes, Inez, please.
Yeah, so again, thank you, everybody. That was a great conversation. I just wanted to quickly respond to this idea of the non-bullshit idea of theory, which I love. And I think it's exactly what Henri is getting at, which is if we allow, his idea of culture, what that would mean sort of in the academy is allowing poetry, art, music, food, the idea of the academy would be expanded into allowing culture, right? So it wouldn't be just these specialized little, what you were talking about, right? These kind of specialized little pieces, like I do this one piece and you do this one piece, it would be an opening up. I mean, he has this whole critique, kind of critique of social sciences taking over like humanities in France. And we can see something similar sometimes in our academies as well, I think in the States. But this idea that, yeah, non-bullshit means allowing for cultural expression. And we don't have a good way of doing that, I think, in America, especially because we're so pragmatic about everything. And so to allow, I think about like the artistic responses in Black Lives Matter, right? Some of the way artists respond to that. I think like that's the non-bullshit way of theorizing.
I totally agree with your critique of hyperspecialization, and I'd love it if, as academics, we could do more cultural, artistic, and other kinds of things. I try and do it a little of my own time. I'm not necessarily great at it, but I agree to open the door for that. Yeah. So,
Mayanthi, did you want to add something there?
I was trying to think if I have a question, but I think it's more a comment, and it's on something slightly different. But JJ, your point about a relativism that is relative to circumstances, I think is actually sort of akin to the way that that the older notion of critique as well, right? That is relative to the circumstances, rather than critique as this kind of positing or even having on the horizon some sort of, or assuming a universal truth of some sort. So I just wanted to point that out more than anything else. And I agree with you. I think that's where I think I would fall too on this notion of truth. The other place that I would want to come at a notion of truth as somehow accessible to humans is, and I'm curious what Andrew would have to say here, but at least in certain Islamic traditions, I mean, humans don't have access to the full truth. Only God does. And so to even try to attempt at getting at truth is not a human endeavor.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll just say something on that. I think that I think that's one of the things that keeping some notion of the theological alive can do for us is to provide a kind of check against our human pretenses for mastery or control at an epistemic, but also perhaps political level, and I think that's the theological can provide a kind of check against overreach on our part as humans and remind us that we are mere humans, so to speak. And so I just want to affirm that, and also to thank the other panelists for stimulating papers that I'm still reflecting on myself. I'm still trying to decide if I have questions for you, but wheels are turning.
I see our audience is producing many questions here, but maybe if I could just ask one small one before we turn to the queue. One of the I was struck by Mayanthi's question of who is asking the questions and who is the we who's speaking at the beginning of the panel, and Inese's positioning of subjectivity opposed to theory. So I'm curious if you all have reflections on the first person singular versus the first person plural versus the third person as the subject or object of theory. And related to that, I wonder if how you all relate to the category of social criticism. I think of Michael Walzer, talking about the way that practices mismatched norms, and that's a function of social criticism, which comes about from a rootedness in a community, a commitment to those practices and those norms, but requires an excavation of what those norms are, looking historically, using tools of theory, and that in that process of social criticism is grounded in care, but is using critique. So I wonder if that's a framework that you all are allergic to or drawn to, or how you might think about that. Does anyone want to?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to respond. Like I'm thinking about this tension or the relationship between I and we, right? And the kind of social, like, how do we determine our place in the society or in any group that we're a part of? And what does that group allow or not allow us to do, right? So the kind of power dimensions of I versus we, right? What is allowable for the subject? So in terms of like Henri, what is the creative potential there? Is the creative possibility of my sensing reality as an individual possible? Or is my social situation like so prescribed or so determined that I have no way of cultural expression, right? You think of a factory worker somewhere in the world making cheap clothes for Target, who works 12 hours a week. There's no possibility for cultural production in that kind of life. So I don't know, I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but.
Wait, why would there be no possibility for cultural production if cultural production if culture here is understood precisely as just kind of human productive capacity?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the way I'm thinking of it is a way of exercising one's creative capacity versus, I think what I'm saying about the factory worker is when you work in a factory 12 hours and you're just so fried by the end of the day, you have no sense of necessarily determining your life or of what you may want to do with it. Your freedom may be determined by your conditions more than you would want it to be.
Okay, I wouldn't want to push back there, I think, just because that seemed, I mean, the way that I understood Henri, and I don't know him as a philosopher, was to understand any kind of human action, even human, just even a conversation with your fellow factory worker about the weather as a form of cultural production, right? Because it's a sort of way of relating to oneself and to the world. And the place where I think also maybe want to explore a little bit is to think about the ways in which, we're always already in relation with non-humans too, right? And so there's kind of, I don't know, and again, I don't know Henri, so I don't want to take this conversation, just in the direction of Henri, because I found it really, really interesting. And there was actually a question in the chat. I think I was just interpolated as an anthropologist to think about what this notion of culture. But I like the idea that that there's this, to me, really kind of expansive capacity for what it means to be human. So anyway, sorry, I'll stop there.
No, I agree. I mean, I think you're right. Like that conversation with a friend, or, but the way in which one's capacity might be deadened by the cultural imposition of having to work in a place that doesn't foster culture. I guess that, there's still culture there because you're a living individual, but that your time may be determined by your social conditions in a way that doesn't help foster it, and limits it, or limits the possibility of it. I guess that's, it's more of it's more of a Marxist critique of it, I guess. But I do think the idea of culture, like I mean, this is what I found fascinating, is just the examples that he offers of like cooking a dinner, right? Just making a meal. We all have that. We all do that in different ways. So, yeah.
We have a very lively question and answer stream here coming in from the sizable audience. I wonder if I might combine a couple of them. I see there Charlie McCurry is asking about enchantment and re-enchantment as a sort of academic category to which people have been gravitating recently, and how that category relates to your reflections on theory, and maybe from a different direction or from the opposite direction. Kevin Schobreck is asking about if we're expanding if within religious studies we're expanding what is licit to talk about in the direction of theology, then what are the limits that remain? What are the kinds of theologies that ought to remain off limits in the sort of study of religion spaces or religious study spaces, or even academic theological spaces? Are there any takers for those?
I'll jump in on the first one because, I've written The Myth of Disenchantment, but in a way, I'm going to answer it in a way that actually Charlie has literally heard me say before. So I'll just say it to him again, but now, in public, maybe. I think neither enchantment nor disenchantment are necessarily emancipative. And I think you can have both systems of domination and hegemonic control that work their way via disenchantment. You can have the quantifying, the numerical, becoming dominant as a way to turn people into mere numbers, but also there are plenty of examples of colonial administrations, and literally the British colonial administration was one of these, who had notions of enchantment built into their projects. So, for example, I'm thinking of Richard Avedon, who is a famous proponent of tantric sex and tantric in magical practices at the very moment where he was a British colonial official. And he was in a way stripping and appropriating indigenous practices from the South Asian cultural context to promote them in the British cultural context, but also in no way denying them. And we could go into even more detail about that if we look at, for example, depending on how we define things, but the bureaucratization of Confucianism and its connection to rights to the gods at the same time as the empire, the creation of a large, massive land empire or what have you. So I don't think either enchantment or disenchantment are liberative. I think we get into a bind if we think that our job is to re-enchant or to disenchant. And then in the second question around what Shilbrook's question about the theological and its limits, I bet other people in this panel have even more exciting things to say about it. But what I think one possibility might be that we would have a better sense of where we actually disagree with each other, because I think the call to keep the theological underground often hides substantive forms of disagreement. And I actually love disagreement. My cultural heritage and for other reasons, I argue with people I love, and that's just how it goes. We just argue constantly in a caring way, though never in a violent or abusive way. But I think we would recognize that we believe all sorts of much more rich and interesting things about within the academy than we recognize if we keep to the constraints of the academic genre as it's currently understood. And I don't know, I would happily sacrifice a false sense of uniformity for more disagreement. And I would like to hear perhaps even more about people talking about where their values, where they're coming from, what they really think, and what really excites them, which I think people sometimes are very reticent about and have located only in the very ends of books or in the footnotes or maybe in the opening remarks. Talking about, I think Mayanthi 3 years ago talked about a cat or something that had a weird experience, and I love that. That was a wonderful story and anecdote. It really gave me a sense of your project and its stakes, and I want us to be able to talk more about those kind of things, the things that we're really committed to and that we really care about, even if they don't fit into a certain model of objectivity, or neutrality or something like that. But again, I'm not a theologian. Others here might have more to say to that.
Well, this is the place where I think I'm coming from too, is and JJ is referring to a story. We were at a conference at Berkeley 3 years ago, like almost to this day, I think. And I told a story of my cat who had died 4 days previously and came back, visited in some fashion, and overturned a water glass next to my table. And just whether I can even tell that story in the secular academy, what sort of implications there are in telling that story, and that has become the pivot around which I've started to really think about the concept of what is possible just generally, but also what is possible in the secular academy. And I'm beginning to really get a sense of the secularity of the academy itself and what kinds of stories can be told and by whom. So the one thing that I would add, I think that's important to bring to the table, is that the very category of nature, the way that we're talking about it, right, is a particular production that emerges with modernity. And it emerges in relationship to the category of the human and also of supernature. And so one of the things that I'm writing about, for instance, is just the attempt to re-engage, to sort of resuture the division between human and nature, or nature and culture, the kind of nature culture turn, continues to leave aside the other part of this formation that was also separated out, which was, you know, the supernatural in some sense, right? And that, I think, gestures precisely to the limits of the secular academy. I'm not going to talk about theology, maybe Andrew can, but I think the theological cuts into the secular academy also in a slightly different way, but cuts at it nonetheless.
Well, one thing I might just add here is when I think about the academy, I don't feel comfortable with the idea of what's allowed in and what's not. Although I recognize that's often a kind of paradigm or a metaphor that we use as if it's a sort of border that we're policing of what can come in and what can't. But instead, I think the way rigor, both intellectual and moral, is achieved, I believe, is not by trying to set up a border, but by you know, having conversations where you know, things that people are offering are being put to these critical tests of a kind of immanent critique, as well as, you know, a sort of analytical critique coming from you know, positions of marginality, you know, communities that are engaged in activist struggle and so on. And so the question for me is, well, how is any given kind of project going to hold up to that sort of scrutiny? But as far as I'm concerned, I don't want to have an a priori rule about, you know, what can come in or out. And so, because I think we're just so inclined to then implicitly have that follow certain geographies that are part of a kind of world system that I'm deeply troubled by. And so I just would rather us err on the side of a kind of borderless sense of the academic space. But then, you know, our saving grace may still be a kind of communal effort at critical thinking.
I do think some of these distinctions, though, I think I taught at a theological school for a long time before I moved to Cal State, which is a public institution. And teaching in the theological world, the idea of like Mayanthi giving the story of the cat would be completely normal, or I feel like at the theological institution I taught at, there would be nothing wrong with that. If I give that story to my colleagues in the philosophy department at Cal State Stan, they would kind of look at me like, what is it that you're saying? Why are you introducing this story? So I do think there are these divisions that appear depending on a discipline. But I think what Henri has made me think about is, yeah, I want to bring those stories more often than not, even if my colleagues look at me like I'm odd, or even if they don't get why is it that she's telling this story, because that is what culture is, and that is what life is, right? That you know.
I wonder if I might shift a little bit. We have a pair of questions here that are inviting us to think about the way that theory as an imagined object has been taken up recently in partisan politics, and asking how we in the academy should think about that, and how that should sort of inflect the way that we think about or do or relate to theory, both inside and outside of the academy. And I suppose if there are helpful ways that we can speak in our public-facing scholarly, when we're wearing our public-facing scholarly hats around those conversations, not only about theory, but about their relationship to truth with whatever level T we want to attribute to it. Are there reflections on that?
I mean, there are a lot of things going on, right? I mean, I think we could talk about the way that various forms of critical theorizing that challenge status quo power are threatening to people in power. I mean, that shouldn't be a surprise to us. I mean, I think that another set of, I mean, yeah, so that'd be my first thought. I mean, the other thing I would add, and this is another piece of historicization, is that there is a tendency to, and I didn't see the cue, I was trying to bring up the question thing, but it didn't, I mean, didn't figure that out. But anyway, of which question it wasn't specific we were responding to. But the other piece of it is that there's sometimes a tension of, there are these frequent false oppositional structures that get articulated. So whether it's the, nature culture opposition or the theory practice opposition or the, there's a proliferation of negatively informed binaries where often you have to look very carefully who's structuring the binary opposition and what are the stakes and how much work are they doing to purify those oppositions. So for example, the notion of science, just to give you an odd one, emerges in part through a critique of philosophy and an appropriation of a central term where it's practical, it's experiential, its experimental philosophy is abstract, it's highfalutin, it's theory or whatever, and one might work, and then that collapses, and then science gets this massive prestige, and then everybody wants to be like science, even though they're not sure what science is exactly. But and there's another opposition, science versus religion, and it organizes a bunch of things. Anyway, I just tend to be suspicious of that way of structuring and to look at those kind of purifying moves. But yeah, I mean, I think that there was a mistake in advocating certain kinds of massive skepticism or particularly dogmatic skepticism as a method of critique. If the idea of critique is like everything is all bullshit, then we don't have or everything is all false, or knowledge is simply power, which is not Foucault, but what people for some reason mistakenly think Foucault argued. That doesn't give us a purchase from which to point out the structures of dominance and power that are in play. But if we have we don't need. We have a quite range of different kinds of theories that are very, very different from each other, but that are all capable of triangulating systems of oppression, and I think those are all equally valuable. But yeah, we'll get pushback for sure if we're challenging power structures, and we embody some power structures that we need to challenge ourselves, right, in the academy as well.
Well, this is a place where, again, I would be curious, Inez, as you were speaking about Henri, I kept thinking there is a kind of weird theory versus life versus facts thing going on here that seems to actually reinscribe some of the conservative pushback against theory. And so I was curious about how, I don't think that's what Henri is doing and how to push back against that. But I think with regard to this particular question, I totally agree with JJ. The issue is less about, it's not the theory part of this, it's the critical race part, right? It's less the theory part than the gender part in France, and the sort of critique of gender theory coming in from America and ostensibly destroying the Republic. So I'm not sure that what we need to do is defend theory so much as defend the critical work that the other parts of that, the critical race part and the gender and sexuality part are doing. But at the same time, I think we do need to push back against the distinction. I think, JJ's point is sort of false distinction between theory and fact, right? Or in theory and practice.
If I can sneak another sort of cluster of questions in here. Some of these questions revolve around the relationship between these terms like critique, theory, and theory, and on the one hand, something like craft, or the crafty form of practice, and on the other hand, metaphysics, which right in strands of theory like Afro-pessimism seem like they're coming back in new forms. So I wonder if you all have reflections on that sort of, is that a spectrum? Are there elements of craft and metaphysics that have been cut off from discussions of theory that need to come back? Or how would you think about those terms?
I don't want to overtalk, but I could talk too much about metaphysics. But so metaphysics and ontology are functional synonyms, and it's weird that we decided that recently ontology is super trendy and that metaphysics is still a bad word somehow. That's a short version of that. But the other piece of it is that it was the case that a particular philosophy of language that we could call post-structuralist or loosely Saussurean, although not actually, did have a certain kind of political intellectual purchase, and it was not a very good theory of language. And so it bracketed out reference, and then you get all this critique, a whole elaborate system of criticism in which if you made certain, everything, meaning was supposed to be differential and non-referential, and the idea was that language in its looser formulation somehow creates the world, something like that. I mean, it becomes not just the moderate Sapir-Whorfianism, language shapes thought, which I think has a lot of evidence for it, but some other more weird, fuzzy, everything is just discourse. And I think that there's been understandably a good pushback against that more recently, because that although it might have been liberating originally, is a kind of project that has run aground and needs to be replaced by better theories about language in the world and culture, or whatever your term is, and how those fit together. Yeah.
Yeah, I just, to JJ's point, I do want to acknowledge one context in which metaphysics and ontology are being very carefully distinguished, and that's in sort of Levinas's philosophy, and then in the way that gets picked up by someone like Dussel, where ontology is sort of code for Heidegger, and actually for the way his philosophy was affiliated, like Schmitt's was, with a kind of particular political regime in Germany and so on. And so that metaphysics has, but then
It's not just me, right?
No, I don't. Andrew.
No, he cut out a really good point, and I was like, just leaning in, and then.
Andrew?
Have some sort of relativism. Yes.
We lost you. Could you maybe in 30 seconds tell us, give us the 30-second version of what you just said? And then sadly, because some of us have a hard stop at the hour, I'm going to have to close things out.
Oh, I'm sorry. My internet must have fell out. In short, metaphysics and ontology have meanings that are very contextual. And sometimes they mean the same thing, sometimes they mean different things. And I think it's just interesting to track those differences in critical spaces, Jewish, Black, otherwise. But in short, I don't think we can say that metaphysics is kind of for critique or against it. We have to kind of look contextually.
And on that note, I am so grateful to all of you for this panel. I don't dare sum things up, but I do just want to flag the wariness around truth that I see from everyone. I think allergy was a word that was thrown around a few times. Truth snuck in here because one of our big projects at the center, in addition to the Beyond Secularization project, is a project called Recovering Truth. And I so appreciate the energy and vigor with which we are wrestling with that concept. I think maybe we can all come together in a space of relativism as a non-bullshit space where justice, livability, life might be cared for, where the transcendental knowledge of life that Henri talks about as the fruit of living, which may be the only truth that mere humans have access to, might empower us to get it right, to speak truth to power. Where that transcendence might break in from the underside in a transformative way. There were so many wonderful questions left in the chat. Some of them, where is Judaism in this discussion, particularly given the genealogy of our theories? What's the difference between a ghost cat and Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior? Something that Mayanthi gestured toward at the end. What about all these conservative legislators who have now discovered facts as something with which they can counter critical race theory? I think, JJ, your notion of evidence is very, very important there. But for those of you who want to follow this or go back over it, a recording of this event and all our events is available at our CSRC webpage under the events tab. And if you want to look for ways to support us, in addition to attending our events, you can find those ways under the support tab. So I want to give a big shout out to everyone at ASU, Villanova, PTN, especially all those who worked behind the scenes to make this possible. Mayanthi, Andrew, Inez, JJ, Vincent, thank you. I hope that when we see each other again, it's in a loud room and we're eating and drinking and shouting at each other joyfully, over the din. And until then, thank you so much, everyone, for attending and for being a part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.